Around 125,000 years ago, humans began moving out of Africa via the Nile River Valley. Ancient Egypt was one of the world's first great civilizations settling in the fertile land around the Nile. They were masters of irrigation and architecture. The Hyksos were Canaanite peoples who took over Egypt. They introduced horse and chariots, compound bows, and advanced hand-to-hand weapons to the Egyptians. The Egyptians eventually freed themselves, ending 108 years of Hyksos rule. The Bantus resided in Central West Africa. The Bantu peoples were separate groups that all spoke Bantu. They slowly migrated south over time. Egyptians traded with Mesopotamians as early as 3500 BCE. Persia was a vast empire with many different cultures and people. They followed the religion Zoroastrianism. Persia was also largely agricultural with a centralized king. Alexander the Great was the great Macedonian leader, who expanded the Greek Empire from India to Egypt and was crowned a pharaoh and created the great Egyptian city of Alexandria. He also spread Hellenistic culture to Africa. During the post-classical era from 600 to 1450, Islam experienced its first and second flowering and great African civilizations rose and fell. Islam was founded by Muhammad, who was born into a family of Bid'ans. After Muhammad's death, there was an issue of succession. The Umayyad dynasty temporarily solved that issue. They ruled from 661 to 750 and were a conquering dynasty of the Sunni sect. While they allowed them to view own religious practices, they imposed a jizya, which was a tax on non-Muslims. The Abbasid ruled from 750 to 1258 until the sack of Baghdad by the Mongols. They heavily supported culture, science, and arts and were not a conquering dynasty. The dynasty did not expand through conquest, but spread beliefs through traders and merchants. Their cities became centers of banking, commerce, crafts, industry, and population. Islam was able to spread along the trade routes such as the Indian Ocean trade routes and the Trans-Saharan trade routes and brought about the second flowering of Islam. One great African civilization was the Swahili city-states. They were thoroughly urban and were centered in cities that were politically independent of one another. Each city was governed by its own king. These city-states helped expand Indian Ocean commerce through gold, ivory, quartz, leopard skins, and were commercial centers for long-distance trade of Chinese porcelain and silk, Persian rugs, and Indian cottons. Another great African civilization was the Great Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was connected to growing trade in gold to the coast as well as to the wealth embodied in its large herd of cattle. Its location was inland between Zambezi and Limpopo rivers, which had rich sources of gold which was in demand on the Swahili coast. Another great civilization was the Ottoman Empire, which was founded by Osman Bey, who was a chief of a band of semi-nomadic Turks who migrated to northwest Anatolia in the 12th century. The Ottoman Empire had unbroken succession from 1289 to 1923. The system known as devshirme required that Balkans gave young boys to become slaves of the Sultan and were educated and trained. Those who became soldiers were known as janissaries. The Ottomans clashed with the Safavids, who were next to Ottomans in the Persian lands. They were also Islamic and of Turkish leadership. During the second great flowering of Islam, there were great African civilizations such as the Sudanic empires in West Africa. First there was Ghana from 100 to 200 CE. They introduced camels into trade in the Sahara, and their rise began in 300 CE. Next, there was Mali, which was centered between Senegal and Niger rivers. Mali took control of salt and gold trades across Sahara. It stretched from salt mines in the northern edge of the Sahara to gold mines in the savannah to the south, from the Atlantic in the west to the copper mines of Takada and beyond in the east. The cities of Mali became centers of commerce, religion, and learning and attracted many scholars. Finally, there was the Songhai Empire, which rose in the second half of the 15th century as the successor of Mali and remained dominant until the 16th century. It was in the crucial intersection of trans-Saharan trade routes and derived much of their revenue from taxing that commerce. The early modern era was from 1450 to 1750, in which Africa was forever changed by the slave trade. For example, it greatly depleted African population in sub-Saharan Africa, and there were political and economic disruptions due to slave trade. Between 1492 and 1776, an estimated 6.5 million people migrated to and settled in the Western Hemisphere. About 5 out of 6 were Africans. For instance, sub-Saharan Africa represented about 18% of the world's population in 1600, but only 6% in 1900. It was said that the continent experienced the loss of a significant part of its able-bodied population, which played a part in the social and political weakening of its societies that left them open in the 19th century to colonial domination and exploitation. The slave trade also reduced able-bodied male workers/mates, which led to polygamy. In total, the productivity and growth of Africa was economically and politically disrupted because of the slave trade. Lastly, towards the end of the early modern era, the Ottoman Empire saw decline due to the rise of the Western world. The scramble for Africa begins with the Berlin Conference, where European statesmen partitioned Africa into colonies. However, no Africans were at the conference. It was this meeting that gave King Leopold of Belgium the right to establish his brutal regime in the Congo, which led to African women held hostage, men overworked, and starvation of the masses due to unattended crops. It was only after international outcry against Leopold's actions in the Congo that he abdicated his territory. In Dutch or Boer or Afrikaners settled South Africa, discovery of gold and diamonds led to an influx of British settlers. The tension between the two groups of settlers led to the Boer Wars. In the end, the British defeated the Boers and created the Union of South Africa, where white privilege continued to dominate over the indigenous Africans. The Zulus also responded negatively to imperialism. After the British discovered rich mineral deposits and diamonds in Zulu territory, a war broke out between the two. The British won and put an end to the Zulu nation's independence. In the 1920s, Pan-Africanism was a movement that created nationalist spirit and strengthened resistance. Africans all over the world wrote about their pride in their African roots and protested colonial rule. During World War I, many Africans served with the Allies in hopes that their service would lead to more rights, but they were wrong. Because of this, opposition to imperialism multiplied in Africa and other parts of the world. The whites tightened their control on their colonies, especially in South Africa, where segregation was put into place. The mandate system was created by the League of Nations after the war, where they would allow a member nation to govern a former German or Turkish colony. In response to growing demands for self-rule after World War II, the British government introduced the Burns Constitution in Ghana in 1946, which incorporated elites, chiefs, and kings of Ghana into the colonial government. Most colonies in Africa followed this arrangement. In areas like Ghana and Kenya, decolonization was generally peaceful. However, areas like Rwanda and Libya suffered for years after the decolonization process. South Africa remained under white rule, which was strengthened when apartheid was put into place. It meant that the government remained at the hands of white settler majority. The ANC was founded to serve as a voice for the South Africans, and their most prominent leader was Nelson Mandela, who helped put an end to apartheid by writing a new constitution.
It is an idea for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
South Africa not only dealt with apartheid, but also an HIV/AIDS epidemic. 12% of the population contracted the virus, which was caused and spread by a flourishing sex trade, population growth, and unsterilized needles used in health clinics. The Rwandan genocide began when the president's plane was shot down in 1994. The Hutus blamed the Tutsis and began executing those in the capital immediately. It soon spread throughout the country. In Sudan, Darfuri rebel movements took up arms against the Sudanese government for marginalization of the area and failure to protect its people from nomads. The government responded by unleashing Arab militias known as Janjaweed. Since then, 400,000 lives have been claimed while while 2,500,000 people have been displaced and 5,000 people die every month while the government denies these estimates and their ties with the Janjaweed.